Hey there dirt bike people, I'm Chuck from TrueTech, and today I'm going to be talking about the viability of the Varg as a legitimate replacement for your current dirt bike. There's no question that electric is starting to make a significant impact on the dirt bike scene. There's a lot that we already know, but what I want to talk about is whether or not the Varg is the electric bike that is going to start replacing combustion engines in real people's garages. Should the Varg be on your radar for your next dirt bike purchase? After spending a few days with the bike, I can tell you right off the bat that there are some significant pros and cons when comparing to a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke, and which ones are important to you will depend on what you like to do with your dirt bike. So here's what I'm going to do. First of all, I'll talk about suspension, chassis geometry, and the motor. Then I'll move on to other drivetrain components that are unique to the Varg, like clutch, gearing, and maps. Then we'll talk about battery life and charging, and what the maintenance schedule and actual cost of ownership looks like on this thing. I really want to dig into whether or not this is a viable contender for dirt bike riders to use as their primary bike. Now, when it comes to two-wheeled electric machines, the spectrum is really broad, and the lines between bicycles and legitimate dirt bikes are blurry. While testing the Varg, we also had a sur-ron Ultra B and a Storm B. The Ultra B is sur-ron's middle-of-the-road option. It's heavier than a bicycle, but it's lighter than a dirt bike. The Storm B is definitely in the dirt bike category, but compared to a small dirt bike, the power is less than exciting, the battery life isn't great, it's heavy, and the chassis feels somewhat rickety. The Ultra B, although not really in the dirt bike category, is super light, extremely nimble, and plenty powerful for a play bike. The Varg is a completely different animal. This is a full-on dirt bike, no doubt about it. While swapping between the Varg and the sur-rons felt like toys, and the Varg felt like a motocross bike. It sits tall and solid, the suspension feels stiff, and the frame is tight and rigid. The Varg handles like a motocross bike too. I was immediately comfortable on it. The weight does feel like it sits a little bit high on the bike, but it really transitions easily into corners and it feels stable at speed as well. Many of you already know that I am definitely an enduro rider, so I am biased from that direction. When switching from the Varg back onto my TPI, I was quite surprised at how different the bikes feel. When I hit a jump on my bike, it has no pop. It does not feel good in the air. When I hit a jump on the Varg, it's stable, predictable, and just easy. The fact that it doesn't have any gears means that you can really compensate in the air. Giving it throttle or hitting the brake in the air makes a huge difference. If you're a little nose heavy and you crack the throttle, it comes up immediately. I didn't hit any big jumps with the Varg, but as soon as I got in the air, it was immediately confidence inspiring. Now, of course, the Varg's lean toward motocross means that it's not as good in technical, tight, rocky terrain. If I was going to ride sandy Michigan single track, I would choose the Varg all day long. But for the type of tight, rocky single track that I like to ride, the bike is not really suited for that in more ways than just because it's a motocross bike. The tall stance of the bike feels a little bit unstable in the rocks, and the stiff suspension obviously is going to bounce you around a lot. This isn't a fault. This is designed to be a motocross bike, and that's exactly what it is, and it does it really, really well. As far as suspension goes, it's got KYB front and back, so any tuner is going to be familiar with it. A simple revalve will get this thing settled right into the rocky terrain for sure. Since the Varg has an electric motor, it doesn't have the normal torque and power curve of a combustion engine. The power curve is basically flat. It has all the power all the time, and that's awesome, but it's also a drawback. The lack of a transmission also means that you can't shift it. With a regular combustion engine, we're used to adjusting RPM with the throttle and gear ratios with the shifter. If we want rapid acceleration and there's plenty of traction, we're going to downshift to put the engine into an RPM zone where there's more power. When we're riding in rough terrain, we want to be able to stay on the throttle without the wheel spinning, so we shift up a gear and put the engine into a zone that will keep us moving forward, but without the power to break the wheel loose. Ultimately, what this means is that when traction is less than ideal, the Varg is harder to control than a regular dirt bike. We discovered this when we ran our first set of drag races between the Varg, the smaller sur-rons, and some Honda dirt bikes. We were all very surprised when the Honda 250RX beat the Varg in a drag race over and over and over again on frosty, grassy ground. We swapped bikes, we tried different power modes, but ultimately there was nothing that we could do to make the Varg beat the little 250. When we turned the horsepower down on the Varg far enough where we could control the wheel spin, we ran out of power on the top end and the 250 pulled us. That natural power curve of a combustion engine ultimately facilitates traction at low RPM and hard acceleration at high RPM. It's kind of a natural traction control. This is simply an area where the Stark Varg currently has a significant disadvantage, and it's even more of a disadvantage in technical terrain.
It's like riding a two-stroke in the power band.
Yeah, just all the time.
This is always on the pipe.
Now, when we raced the Varg against my TPI 300 and against my buddy Kyle's CR 500, the conditions were ideal. We had nice loamy ground. The CR500 had a recluse, which made it really easy on the starts, and also managing wheel spin further into the RPM range. Basically, on the CR, once the power came on, all we had to do was sit all the way forward and shift gears. Even with these ideal conditions though, the Stark Varg still struggled. It wasn't like once we got it on the loam, it just took off. The first problem we had was that it has so much power that it wanted to either spin or wheelie. Even dialing it back down to 60 horsepower is crazy. And 100%, it's our human limitations that hold the Varg back from absolutely destroying anything. But that's really what it comes down to when we're talking about whether or not this bike is going to replace real people's current dirt bikes. So we were still struggling to get the Stark Varg to beat the 500 or my TPI, and that's when Dallas had a brilliant idea. And I don't know why we didn't think of this earlier, but he asked why we weren't using the map switch to shift on the fly. The controller on the Stark Varg has a massive range of adjustability. You can adjust it from 10 horsepower all the way up to 80, and you can also adjust regenerative braking, which makes a huge difference. Personally, I like it more like a two-stroke, so I turn the regenerative braking way down.
I'm gonna go 52 horsepower, 35% braking.
Now, it took a little bit of testing to get it all tuned in, but eventually we settled on a horsepower progression from about 35 in map 1 to 80 in map 5. This allowed us just to hold it wide open and then shift gears as speed increased. It made body position and throttle control much less important, and this is when the Stark Varg really started to take off.
Chuck told me to launch in first gear and then start grabbing gears, so we're gonna see what happens here.
Because the electric motor is so easily and quickly tuned, we were able to set it up ideally for the current conditions. We switched bikes back and forth, and ultimately whoever didn't make a mistake would win. The Stark Varg definitely has more horsepower, but again, there's so much that it comes down to human mistakes. I think in the future, we're gonna start to see something like a dynamic traction control or a grid style map like a combustion engine so that we can tune horsepower across a curve. In the comments on Instagram, I've already come across several really neat ideas for this. For now, what it means is that in technical terrain, riders are going to be downshifting with their map switch in order to maintain traction, and then upshifting when they want that explosive horsepower. And that makes the bike extremely versatile. It's so cool. Now, there's still one mechanical issue that we need to talk about. With a combustion engine, we have a clutch. Now, there's a mountain of debate on this topic, and as with any divisive topic, there are pros and cons. So let's lay this out. I've compiled a list of pros and cons, and we'll start with the pros. Number 1, simplicity. On the Stark Varg, we have 3 inputs instead of 5. You could say 4 if you include the map switch. But basically, we have a front brake, a rear brake, and a throttle. Ultimately, there are less things to screw up. Number 2, feet are obtuse. No matter what you say, you will not convince me that you have more control with your lower leg pushing on that brake than with this little finger. Number 3, brake loading. The rear brake can be used to weight and de-weight the bike, similar to how you would use a clutch. There are lots of enduro riders using a left-hand rear brake already, and that's what they do. Number 4, brake access, especially on hills. Number 5, and this is probably the one that I found the most significant and the most surprising. You can stay on the balls of both of your feet. Because there are no pedals to manipulate with your feet, you can keep them on the balls all the time, and the balance advantage is surprisingly significant. Now, I'm sure I missed some pros, so I hope that you guys will add those in the comments, but we're gonna move on to the cons. Number 1, whiskey throttle. This is a huge disadvantage. There is no clutch, so if you twist the throttle, there is nothing stopping 80 horsepower from sending your bike off a berm and into orbit. There's no getting around how dangerous that is. Number 2, power modulation. The clutch gives us advantages of a low gear while we're in a high gear, and we can modulate power on the fly with one little finger. We can control momentum dynamically with our finger instead of with this large wrist. If the wrist was as good for fine movements as a finger, then we would be holding pencils with our fists, and keyboards would look like whack-a-mole games. This is not a debate. Big muscles, small muscles. Coarse adjustment, fine adjustment. There's a reason why motorcycles have evolved the way that they have. Number 3, engine spooling. I'm personally not skilled enough to be able to utilize this, but trials riders or highly skilled enduro riders will miss this. Again, I have definitely missed some cons, so feel free to leave them in the comments. Personally, as usual, I think it comes down to what you want to do with your dirt bike. If you're riding sandy, flowy single track, or motocross, the extra power and the simplicity probably easily outweighs the cons. If you're riding hard enduro and you're an intermediate or an expert, you're definitely going to miss the clutch. So that's how the bike works from a rider perspective. Now let's talk a little bit about battery life and maintenance. There is a fair bit of information on battery life out there already, but I think it makes sense to sum it up here. If you're a fast motocross rider, you're probably not going to get a full hour out of a battery. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're using this bike to go trail riding with your friends, you're probably going to be able to be out there for 6, 7, or 8 hours depending on how often you stop. Many of you already know that if you're out riding all day, you only put a couple of engine hours on your bike. I don't think that in most cases the Stark Varg's battery is going to take you quite as far as a 9 or 10 liter tank, but it's not far off. If you do happen to run out of power, it's not as easy as bringing a water bottle full of fuel and you're on your way again, but the Stark Varg does have an accurate battery gauge on the display. The Varg will also start to power down and save itself once the battery gets low. So again, there are variables and it depends on what you're going to do with your dirt bike. The maintenance advantages, however, are pretty undeniably awesome. The Stark Varg does have a small gearbox that requires periodic oil changes, but other than that, you can pretty much cut out all of the other engine-related maintenance. No pistons, no cranks, no clutch plates, no shifting mechanisms, and no valves. Of course, there are still suspension and chassis maintenance items to take care of, but when you consider the advantages of not having to deal with a combustion engine, the roughly 25% price increase becomes very reasonable. Now, what if there's an issue? Whether you've got a 4-stroke or a 2-stroke, you can pretty much take it to any shop if you have an issue and the mechanic is at least going to understand the platform. We're definitely going to start to see some issues with the batteries, the controllers, and the motors themselves. Mechanical failures aren't very difficult to deal with because you can see what's going on, but if you have a cell that's out of balance or you have an internal relay that fails, this could get really complicated really quickly and it could be difficult to find service. Now, dealers are starting to pop up all over the place quite quickly, but proximity to a dealer is probably something that you want to consider if you're buying a Stark Varg. My local dealer, Outlaw Motorsports, is a 30-minute drive from my house, and they ordered 50 of these things right off the bat. Hopefully many other dealers will do likewise, and that way what needs to happen with the service situation will ramp up very quickly. Now, while we're on the topic of batteries, we should discuss the possibility of spontaneous combustion. When I picked up the bike, I got a lot of information about it, and one of the things I learned is that the battery is a lithium polymer battery. Now, I'm no battery expert, but if you know anything about lithium polymer, you know that you do not want to drop that battery on a rock. In case you're curious, just go to YouTube and type in lithium polymer experiments, and it's a good rabbit hole. Now, lithium polymer has been around for a long time, so hopefully Stark Varg has got that figured out and has the battery quite protected. One of the big questions that I had when I was at the dealership was how many charge cycles are these batteries going to go for? And there's actually quite a bit of information on it already. These batteries should see 0 degradation over 250 charge cycles, and it looks like a practical battery life will be something in excess of 1,000 charge cycles. Even if it's significantly less than that, if you consider an average of 2 hours of riding per tank of fuel, that's 2,000 hours of ride time on a single battery. That's incredible. If you would actually ride the bike until the battery died, you'd probably save so much money that you could buy a couple extra motorcycles. If Stark Varg's predictions are even half right, there's a good chance that the motorcycle will fall apart around the battery before it ever fails. And that's a good thing because the batteries are over $10,000. Now, this is of course contingent on good battery care, and that's a significant factor. And unfortunately for you motocross riders, good battery care basically means charging it as slowly as possible. The stock 110 volt charger is adjustable between 3 and 10 amps, and there is a 220 volt charger which will significantly increase the speed of the charge, but it's also going to adversely affect the battery life. A 3-hour charge time is a reasonable expectation on the 110 volt charger. If you're an average moto racer and you're doing 2 30-minute motos per day, you shouldn't really have trouble charging up the bike on a generator in between motos, even if it's not up to 100%. Now, if you're an expert or if you like to race 2 different classes throughout the day, you could be having issues. Again, this is where it really comes down to a personal thing. For some riders, the Stark Varg could be the answer to what they've been looking for, and for other riders, even moto riders, it might not make sense. So there's no doubt that the Stark Varg is an absolute weapon. It's the most powerful dirt bike that I've ever ridden, the most exhilarating motorcycle I've ever been on, and the chassis and suspension work extremely well also. The versatility of the bike is also very impressive. Because of the adjustability of the power, I would be completely comfortable letting my kids ride the bike, or a complete beginner. In 10 horsepower mode, the thing barely gets out of its own way. I think if you're someone who likes to ride gnarly technical terrain or hard enduro like I do, the Stark Varg right now is probably not the bike for you. I am really excited though to see what Stark Varg comes out with in the future to fill that clutch gap. If you're a moto rider or you like faster flowy trails, the Stark Varg could be a serious contender for you. It handles well, the suspension's good, the motor is definitely powerful enough, the maintenance is a no-brainer, and the cost of ownership is at least comparable to a traditional dirt bike. Personally, I could not care less about the sound of my 2-stroke or the feeling of grabbing another gear. The Stark Varg is unique, and when comparing miles per mile, the arm stretching power and simplicity of operation are absolutely giggle-inducing. Now, obviously this is a huge topic, and I've just cut off a tiny little slice. I know that Dallas from the E-Rag and Barry Morris from Cross Training Enduro Skills are going to have their own unique perspectives, so if you're at all E-curious, you'll probably want to check out what they have to say as well. I'd also really like to hear your thoughts on the Varg. I'm curious to know how many people have already tried the bike, and how many of you struggle with getting used to not using the clutch, or the left-hand rear brake, or not shifting gears, or have you played with the map switch, or maybe you've come up with a different way to modulate power than I have. For those of you that feel more comfortable in the air than I do, how do you feel that it jumps? So at the end of the day, I don't know if the Stark Varg is going to be the electric bike that comes into the dirt bike space and starts replacing combustion engines, but there's certainly a good chance. There's no doubt that the Stark Varg is definitely a legitimate dirt bike, and there's also no doubt that it's a lot of fun to ride. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you want to see what I'm doing on a more day-to-day basis, you can find that content on Instagram, and as always, I very much appreciate your time, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the Stark Varg.